Boring history for sleep. Let us begin very, very gently. We are going to travel back in time, not with a flash of light or a dramatic whoosh, but slowly, the way a heavy fog rolls in over a flat field just before dawn. We are going somewhere quiet, somewhere old, somewhere where the earth was wide and unhurried, and the pace of human life was measured not in minutes but in seasons. We are going back roughly 12,000 years. 12,000 years. That is a very long time. Long enough that the idea of a calendar did not yet exist. Long enough that the wheel had not been invented. Long enough that the mightiest empires you have ever read about in school had not yet drawn their first breath. The pyramids were still thousands of years in the future. The great libraries of Alexandria still thousands of years away. We are in a world that is vast and green in some places and dry in others, and almost entirely silent in the way that only truly wild places can be. Most of the people alive at this time were what historians call hunter-gatherers. This is a straightforward term. It means exactly what it says. These people hunted animals and they gathered plants. They did not stay in one place for very long. They moved with the seasons, following herds of animals, following the ripening of certain fruits and nuts and roots, always tracking the slow turning of the world toward food and away from it. A hunter-gatherer group was usually small, perhaps 20 to 50 people, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit fewer. They knew each other very well. They knew the land they moved through very well. They could identify hundreds of different plants by sight, smell, touch. They knew which roots were safe to eat and which would make you sick. They knew which berries ripened in late summer and where the wild grain grew thickest in the valleys. This was a profound and deep kind of knowledge, the kind that took a lifetime to accumulate and was passed down carefully through stories and demonstration, generation after generation. There were no farms, there were no fields, there were no fences or furrows or irrigation ditches. The land simply was what it was, and the people moved gently through it, taking what they needed and leaving the rest. Now, one of the things scientists have discovered through careful study of ancient remains, through analysis of fossilized plant material, through tiny fragments of bone and charcoal preserved in the earth for thousands of years, is that this way of life was, in many respects, not a bad one. Hunter-gatherers, on average, worked perhaps 4 to 6 hours a day acquiring food. The rest of their time was spent resting, socializing, making things, and simply existing in the world. Their bones, when examined by archaeologists, tend to show fewer signs of chronic repetitive stress than the bones of early farmers. They were often well-nourished, eating a wide variety of foods. But the world was changing. Slowly, slowly, the world was changing. Around 14,000 years ago, give or take 1,000 years, which in geological time is practically nothing, the climate of the Earth began to warm. The last great ice age was drawing to a close. Glaciers that had covered enormous swaths of the northern hemisphere were slowly, steadily retreating northward. As they retreated, they left behind rich, churned-up soils. Rivers ran differently. Coastlines shifted. New habitats opened up. In parts of what we now call the Middle East, a region sometimes referred to by historians as the Fertile Crescent, which stretched in a broad arc from modern-day Israel and Jordan up through Syria and Turkey and down through Iraq, conditions were becoming extraordinarily favorable for certain kinds of plants, grasses in particular. Wild grasses with heavy, starchy seeds, grasses like wild einkorn wheat, wild emmer wheat, wild barley. These grasses had been part of the human diet for a very long time. People had been gathering their seeds and eating them for thousands of years before anything we could call farming began. But something was different now. The plants were growing in denser, more reliable stands, and the people who lived near them were beginning to notice something remarkable. If you returned to the same hillside year after year, if you came back every autumn when the grain was ripe and gathered it carefully, the plants would be there. They did not move. They waited. And if some of the seeds you accidentally dropped while carrying them home took root near your camp and new plants grew there in the spring, well, that was interesting, wasn't it? This is how it began, not with a grand invention, not with a moment of inspiration, but with slow, patient observation repeated over many generations until the relationship between certain human communities and certain plants became something new. Something we might cautiously begin to call agriculture. The very first agricultural tools were not invented for agriculture. They were tools that already existed, tools that human beings had been using for hundreds of thousands of years. And they were simply repurposed, adapted, and eventually refined for the new work of tending plants. The simplest and most ancient of these was the digging stick. This is, as the name suggests, a stick used for digging. It is almost insultingly simple, and yet the digging stick was perhaps the single most important agricultural tool for thousands of years, and versions of it are still used in parts of the world today. A digging stick was typically a length of hardwood, something dense and strong, like oak or acacia, roughly the height of a person's hip, sharpened to a point at one end by rubbing it against rough stone, and sometimes hardened further by holding that point briefly in fire. The heat of the fire, if applied carefully, would drive moisture from the wood and make the fibers harder and more resistant to splitting. With a digging stick, a person could loosen soil, lever up roots, make small holes for seeds, and harvest root vegetables like wild tubers and bulbs without destroying the plant entirely. The digging stick was the beginning of what would eventually, over thousands of years, become the plow. We should pause for a moment and appreciate just how slowly these developments happened. When we talk about the development of agricultural tools, we are not talking about decades. We are not even talking about centuries in the way we usually think of them. We are talking about processes that unfolded over thousands of years, changes so gradual that no single person or even any single generation of people would have noticed them happening. This is important to understand because it sets the pace of our story. Our story is an unhurried one. Alongside the digging stick, early agricultural people used stone tools that had been developed much earlier. The hand axe, for instance, a teardrop-shaped piece of flint or obsidian or quartzite, shaped by careful striking, had been in use for over 1 million years by the time farming began. Early farmers used modified versions of these hand tools to chop roots, to scrape bark from branches, to cut grasses. The sickle, or rather its earliest ancestor, appeared quite early in the agricultural story. A sickle is a curved blade used to cut grain at the stalk. The first sickles were not metal, of course. They were composite tools, a handle of wood or bone, with a series of small, very sharp flint blades set into a groove along one edge, held in place with natural resins and plant fibers. Archaeologists have found examples of these early sickles at sites in the Fertile Crescent dating back 11,000 years or more. When scientists examine these ancient flint blades under microscopes, they can see something remarkable, a distinctive kind of wear pattern called sickle gloss. This is a sheen that develops on the cutting edge of a blade when it is used repeatedly to cut silica-rich plant stems, grass stems in particular. Silica is a mineral, and it is present in the cell walls of grasses. When a flint blade cuts through grass stems hundreds and hundreds of times, the silica in the grass slowly polishes the stone, creating a characteristic shiny stripe along the cutting edge. When archaeologists find a blade with sickle gloss, they know with considerable confidence that the person who made and used that blade was harvesting grain. The presence of sickle-glossed blades at a site, combined with the remains of domesticated grain and the remains of permanent or semi-permanent structures, is one of the key markers that tells archaeologists, here, people were farming. Another early tool was the grinding stone, or quern. This is a flat stone, usually somewhat concave from use, on which grain could be placed and then ground into flour using a smaller rounded stone called a handstone or muller. The muller was pressed down onto the grain and moved back and forth, or in a circular motion, crushing the seeds against the flat surface of the quern below. Grinding grain is slow, repetitive physical work. It requires sustained effort and produces, when done properly, a coarse flour that can be mixed with water and cooked on a hot stone to make a simple flatbread. The earliest breads were nothing like modern bread. They were dense, flat, slightly gritty. The grindstone never got all the particles of stone dust out of the flour, and unleavened. There was no yeast, no rising, just grain ground to flour mixed with water cooked on fire. But it was nourishing, it was portable, it could sustain people through lean times, and it was, in its humble way, a kind of miracle, the transformation of a handful of grass seeds into something a person could eat and be grateful for. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, in the hills and valleys of the Fertile Crescent, something quietly remarkable happened. People began to stay put. Not all at once, not everywhere. The shift from nomadic to settled life was gradual, patchy, and reversible. There were communities that settled for a few generations and then, for various reasons, drought, soil exhaustion, conflict, packed up and moved again. But over time, in certain favored locations, settlements became permanent. Houses were built to last. Grain was stored in purpose-built storage pits and containers. Graveyards appeared, a profound sign that a community intended to remain in one place, because you do not bury your dead and then simply walk away from them. One of the oldest and most fascinating of these early settlements is a site called Jericho, located in what is now the West Bank, near the Jordan River. People have been living at Jericho continuously for an extraordinarily long time. The oldest layers of occupation at the site date back approximately 11,000 years. The very name Jericho has an ancient ring to it, and that is because it is an ancient place, one of the oldest continuously inhabited spots on Earth. At these early permanent settlements, the relationship between people and tools began to change. When you are moving from place to place, you carry only what you can carry. Tools must be lightweight, multi-purpose, and easy to replace if lost or broken. But when you have a home, a permanent structure, a storage area, a community that stays in one location, you can begin to accumulate things. You can invest time in making tools that are heavier, more specialized, more carefully crafted. This is when we begin to see the very slow, very gradual emergence of more sophisticated agricultural implements. The hoe, for instance, is a significant step up from the digging stick. A hoe is a tool with a flat or slightly curved blade attached at an angle to a handle, so that it can be pulled or pushed across the surface of the soil to break it up, to clear weeds, to create shallow furrows for seeds. Early hoes were made from bone, particularly the shoulder blades of large animals, which are broad and flat and with a handle attached, work quite effectively as a hoe blade. Later hoes used worked stone blades, later still wood, eventually much later metal. The basic mechanical principle of the hoe, a flat blade pulled through soil at a shallow angle, has not fundamentally changed in 10,000 years. Modern garden hoes still work on exactly the same principle as those ancient shoulder blade hoes used by early farmers in the Fertile Crescent. Alongside the hoe, early farmers also used a simple form of the mattock. A mattock is a tool similar to a hoe but typically heavier, with a broader, thicker blade used for breaking up harder, more compacted soil. Mattocks were used to till, that is, to turn over and loosen the earth before planting. And they were important because loose, well-aerated soil allows plant roots to penetrate more easily, holds water better, and generally produces healthier crops. The work of tilling the soil by hand with a mattock or hoe is extremely laborious. An experienced farmer working good soil with a hand hoe might manage perhaps 1/4 of an acre per day, on a good day, in good conditions. This meant that early farms were necessarily small. A family plot of perhaps 1 to 3 acres was typical, and every spring before planting, the soil had to be worked. Every family in every early farming village spent days or weeks each spring breaking up the earth with hand tools, preparing the ground for the seeds that would feed them through the coming year. It is worth pausing here to simply imagine this. Imagine a warm spring morning in a small village somewhere in what is now northern Syria or southeastern Turkey. Approximately 9,000 years ago, the air smells of turned earth and dry grass. A woman is working a small field at the edge of the village, pulling a bone-bladed hoe through the pale soil in long, steady strokes. Her children are nearby. In the distance, other villagers are doing the same work. There is no sound of machinery, no engines, no metal striking stone, just the soft, rhythmic scrape of bone against earth and the wind and the distant sound of goats. This is where our story lives, in the quiet, patient labor of ordinary people doing small, necessary things. While all of this was happening with plants, the slow domestication of wheat and barley and lentils and peas, something parallel and equally important was happening with animals. The domestication of animals is a story as old and complex as the domestication of plants, and it unfolded on a similar timescale. The dog was the first animal to be domesticated. This occurred long before farming, perhaps 15,000 years ago or more, when wolves began associating with human groups, likely attracted by food scraps. Over many generations, the wolves that were most comfortable around humans were the ones that survived and reproduced, and their descendants became progressively more tame, more dependent on human company, and eventually became what we recognize as dogs. But dogs, for all their usefulness in hunting and guarding, could not pull a plow. For that, farmers needed something much larger. The goat was among the first large animals to be domesticated for agricultural purposes, with evidence of goat domestication in the Zagros Mountains of modern-day Iran dating back roughly 10,000 years. Sheep followed shortly thereafter, domesticated in much the same region. Then pigs, then cattle. Cattle, specifically the domestication of wild aurochs into domestic cattle, was a particularly significant development for agriculture because cattle are large, strong animals capable of doing sustained physical work. An auroch, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, was an enormous beast. A large bull might stand 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh over a ton. It was a formidable animal. The process of domesticating it, which occurred roughly 10,000 years ago in what is now Turkey and independently in other regions, was a long and gradual one involving many generations of selective breeding and habituation. But why does cattle domestication matter so much to the story of agricultural tools? Because cattle provided something that human muscles alone could not: draft power. Draft power is the use of animal strength to pull things. Specifically, to pull agricultural implements through the soil. And this was transformative in a way that is difficult to overstate. A single ox, a castrated male cattle used for heavy work, can exert a sustained pulling force many times greater than a human being. Where a person with a hoe or mattock might be able to till 1/4 of an acre per day with great effort, a pair of oxen pulling a simple plow could work several acres per day. This change in the scale of what was possible was enormous. But the plow did not appear immediately upon the domestication of cattle. There was a gap, a long gap, spanning many centuries, between the time when people first had domesticated cattle and the time when they first began using those cattle to pull agricultural implements. This is because the idea of harnessing an animal to a tool is not obvious. It requires a kind of conceptual leap, the realization that the animal's strength can be directed and applied to a specific task. And it also requires the development of the physical apparatus to make it happen. The yoke, the harness, the traces, and eventually the plow itself. The yoke is a device placed across the necks or shoulders of a pair of working animals, usually cattle, to which a load can be attached. The earliest yokes were likely very simple: a straight piece of wood tied to the animals' necks with strips of leather or plant fiber, with the load, perhaps a heavy sledge or a simple drag, tied to the middle of the yoke. Over time, yokes became more sophisticated, better fitted to the animal's anatomy, and more efficient at transferring the animal's pulling force into useful work. There is something deeply calming about thinking of oxen and yokes. Picture it: 2 broad-shouldered animals, side by side, their breath making small clouds in the cool morning air, moving with slow, deliberate steps across a field. Their pace is unhurried. They are not rushed. They simply walk, and as they walk, the earth parts before them and something new becomes possible. The very first plow was not what most people picture when they hear the word plow. It did not turn the soil over. It did not create the neat, deep furrows we associate with modern plowed fields. It was a much simpler thing, and it is known by several names: the scratch plow, the ard, the forked stick plow. The ard was, in its most basic form, a heavy, pointed wooden implement that was dragged through the soil, creating a shallow groove or scratch in the earth. It did not invert the soil. It did not turn it upside down the way a modern moldboard plow does. It simply scraped through the upper layer, loosening and aerating it, breaking up the crust that forms on dry soil. The earliest ards were probably not much more than large, sturdy, forked branches, with one branch serving as the share, the part that cuts into the soil, and the other branches forming the handles and the beam by which the implement was attached to the draft animal. Wood was everywhere. It was free. It was workable with stone tools, and a large, well-chosen forked branch was already more or less the right shape for an ard. The oldest evidence of ard use comes from several sources. In some parts of Europe, particularly in northern regions where conditions for preservation are favorable, archaeologists have found what are called ard marks, the physical traces left in the soil by ancient plowing, preserved beneath later layers of earth and detectable through careful excavation. These ard marks, left by the scratch plow cutting through subsoil layers, have been dated back as far as 6,000 years in some locations. In other places, the ard itself has been preserved. The most remarkable examples come from Danish bogs, where the cold, acidic, anaerobic conditions that exist in certain types of peat bogs are extraordinarily favorable to the preservation of organic material. A wooden object submerged in a Danish bog can survive for thousands of years in conditions that would destroy it anywhere else. And indeed, archaeologists have recovered wooden ards from Danish bogs that are roughly 5,000 years old, complete enough that their design and construction can be studied in detail. These ancient Danish ards are surprisingly elegant objects. They are made from naturally bent wood, chosen and shaped to take advantage of the grain and strength of the timber. The share, the cutting part, tapers to a robust point. The stilt or handle extends at the right angle for a farmer to walk behind and guide the implement. The beam, which extends forward to where the animals are attached, is carefully shaped and smoothed. These are not crude objects. They are the product of considerable skill and accumulated knowledge about what works and what doesn't. Using an ard effectively required a particular technique. Because the ard only scratched the surface and did not invert the soil, early farmers often plowed their fields twice, once in one direction, and then again at right angles to the first plowing. This cross-plowing broke up the soil more thoroughly and helped control weeds, because the second pass disturbed plants that had begun to grow in the furrows made by the first pass. The resulting pattern of intersecting scratches in the soil is visible in some ancient field systems and has left traces that archaeologists can still detect today. The fields that were farmed with early ards were typically small and roughly square or nearly square in shape. because cross-plowing was easiest in a field that was not much longer in one direction than the other. Later, as plows improved and the technique of deep plowing developed, field shapes changed. But in the early days of the art, the square field was practical and common. One important limitation of the wooden ard was that the wooden share wore down quickly. Dragging a piece of wood through soil, even relatively soft soil, is hard on the wood. A wooden share might last only a day or two of heavy work before it wore down or split. This led early farmers to seek ways to extend the life of their shares and make them more effective. One solution was to fire-harden the wooden share tip, just as digging sticks had been fire-hardened. Another was to tip the wooden share with stone, to attach a pointed flint or other hard stone to the end of the wooden share, so that it was the stone, rather than the wood, that made contact with the soil. Stone-tipped ard shares have been found at archaeological sites, and they represent an important transitional step between purely wooden tools and the later metal-tipped implements. It is worth pausing for a moment to think about the patience required to make a stone-tipped ard share. The stone tip itself, shaped by knapping, by carefully striking flint with another stone to remove flakes and shape the core into the desired point, might take many hours to produce. It had to be the right size, the right shape, attached to the wooden share securely enough to withstand the forces of plowing without coming loose. Every farmer who made one of these was both a woodworker and a stoneworker. These were not specialists. They were people who had to know how to do many things, and to do them well enough that their family would be fed. Farming did not begin in one place and then spread instantly across the world. It began in several places, more or less independently, over a span of several thousand years. And once it did begin, it spread slowly, sometimes through migration, as farming peoples moved into new territories, and sometimes through diffusion, as ideas and seeds and domesticated animals were gradually passed from one group to the next across trade networks and social connections. The Fertile Crescent, as we have discussed, was one of the earliest and most important cradles of agriculture. It is here, in the arc of productive land stretching through what is now Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, that wheat, barley, lentils, peas, flax, and several other crops were first domesticated, and where cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs were first brought under human management. But farming also developed independently in China, where millet was domesticated in the Yellow River Valley and rice in the Yangtze River Valley, beginning perhaps 9,000 years ago. In the Americas, maize, corn, was domesticated in what is now Mexico from a wild grass called teosinte, a process that began around 9,000 years ago. Squash and beans were domesticated there as well. In New Guinea, taro and bananas were cultivated from very early dates. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and other crops were domesticated independently. Each of these independent origins of farming produced its own toolkit, its own set of implements adapted to the specific crops, soils, and conditions of its particular region. The tools used to cultivate rice in the Yangtze Valley were somewhat different from those used to cultivate wheat in the Fertile Crescent, which were somewhat different from those used to cultivate maize in Mesoamerica. But the underlying principles were similar. Loosen the soil, plant the seed, tend the crop, harvest the grain. The spread of farming from the Fertile Crescent into Europe is one of the great slow migrations of human history. It began perhaps 8,000 years ago, as farming peoples from Anatolia, what is now Turkey, began moving westward into the Aegean and the Balkans, bringing their domesticated crops and animals and their knowledge of farming techniques with them. Over the next several thousand years, farming spread gradually across Europe, west through Greece and Italy and France and Spain, north through Central Europe, and eventually reaching Scandinavia and the British Isles. This spread was not a conquest. It was not an army marching across a continent. It was more like a slow tide, advancing unevenly, with local hunter-gatherer populations sometimes adopting farming practices, sometimes intermarrying with farming peoples, sometimes retreating or coexisting alongside farmers. It was a human story of the most ordinary kind, people meeting people, exchanging ideas and foods and tools, changing gradually and without drama over many generations. As farming spread, the tools of farming spread with it. The art was adapted to new soils and new conditions. In some regions where soils were lighter and more easily worked, simple wooden ards functioned well. In other regions where soils were heavier and more clay, improvements were needed. And so the process of tool development continued, slowly and steadily, driven by the practical needs of people trying to feed themselves and their families. Let us settle into this slow pace for a moment. Let us breathe with it. Thousands of years passing like a slow exhale. Villages growing, fields expanding. Generations of farmers waking up to the same morning light, picking up the same kinds of tools their grandparents had used, and going out to do the same patient work in the soil. Let us travel now to a particular place and time, the broad, flat plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. This region is called Mesopotamia, from the Greek words meaning the land between the rivers. It is one of the great cradles of human civilization, and it is where some of the most important early developments in agricultural tools and techniques took place. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia 7,000 years ago was quite different from what it is today. It was a place of marshes and seasonal floods, of rich alluvial soil deposited by the rivers as they overflowed their banks each spring, of reed beds and wildfowl and fish. The soil was extraordinarily fertile. The silt carried down from the mountains by the Tigris and Euphrates was among the most productive agricultural soil in the ancient world. But the climate was also dry and hot, with very little rainfall, particularly in the south. This created both an opportunity and a challenge. The soil could produce enormous harvests, but only if it received water. This was the problem that drove one of the great technological achievements of the ancient world: irrigation. Irrigation is the artificial application of water to agricultural land. The idea is straightforward. If your crops need more water than the rain provides, you bring water to them through human-engineered means: channels, ditches, pipes, buckets. But the engineering required to do this at scale, in a landscape like the Mesopotamian plain, was anything but simple. The earliest irrigation in Mesopotamia was probably very modest. Small channels dug by hand, using tools we have already discussed: digging sticks, bone hoes, simple wooden spades, to direct water from the edge of a river or a natural pond out to nearby fields. A family might spend several days digging a channel a few hundred feet long to bring water to their crops. This was hard work, but it was work within the capacity of a small group of people. Over time, as villages grew larger, and as the productivity that irrigation made possible allowed populations to increase, the scale of irrigation works grew as well. By around 6,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia, there were irrigation systems that served not just a single family or a single village, but entire districts, networks of main canals, branching into secondary canals, branching again into small field channels, all carefully maintained and managed to distribute water from the rivers to the fields. These larger irrigation systems required tools that could move significant amounts of earth. The simple digging stick was inadequate for excavating a main canal several yards wide and several feet deep. What was needed were more robust shoveling and scraping tools. Ancient Mesopotamian farmers used wooden spades and shovels, flat-bladed tools with long handles, designed for moving loose earth efficiently. They also used baskets, large woven baskets in which excavated soil could be carried away from the dig site. The combination of a spade to loosen and scoop the earth and a basket to carry it away was the primary earth-moving technology of the ancient world. And it was the technology that built not only irrigation canals, but also the great mounds on which Mesopotamian cities were built. Another important tool in ancient Mesopotamian agriculture was the cedar plow. This was a remarkable innovation, an early form of the seed drill, consisting of an ard or simple plow with a funnel or tube attached, through which seeds could be dropped directly into the furrow as the plow moved along. This meant that seeds were planted at a consistent depth and spacing, which improved germination and made the crop easier to tend and harvest. The cedar plow is depicted in some of the oldest agricultural imagery that survives from ancient Mesopotamia, small clay tablets. Some of the world's first written documents contain farming instructions that mention the cedar plow. One ancient Sumerian text, known to scholars as the Farmer's Almanac and dating to approximately 4,000 years ago, gives detailed advice on the proper use of the cedar plow, including how many fingers depth the furrows should be and how to set the seed rate. It is remarkable to think that someone 4,000 years ago sat down and wrote instructions about how to plant grain, and that those instructions survived, preserved in dried clay, for us to read today. The Mesopotamian plain is very flat, and the rivers that flow through it carry enormous quantities of silt. This silt, while wonderfully fertile, also had a habit of clogging irrigation canals. Maintaining an irrigation system in Mesopotamia required constant work, clearing silt from the canals, repairing breaches where water had broken through the canal banks, ensuring that the distribution of water was fair and consistent across all the farms that depended on it. This need for organized, collective maintenance of irrigation infrastructure was one of the forces that drove the development of the first cities and the first governments in Mesopotamia. When the irrigation system is what stands between your community and famine, and when that system requires the coordinated labor of hundreds or thousands of people to maintain, you need some form of coordination. You need administrators, record keepers, leaders. And so the city grew, and with it, the first experiments in large-scale human organization. But that is a story for another time. For now, let us simply sit with the image of those irrigation canals. The slow, brown water moving through channels lined with reed beds. The flat fields stretching away in every direction under a pale blue sky. The sound of the water a constant soft murmur in the heat of the afternoon. For thousands of years, for most of the story we have told so far, agricultural tools were made from wood, bone, stone, and plant fiber. These materials were not without their merits. Flint, properly knapped, can hold an edge sharp enough to shave with. Bone, properly dried and worked, is strong and somewhat flexible. Hardwood, properly seasoned and shaped, can last for many years of use. But these materials all had limitations. Flint is brittle. It can shatter under heavy impact. Bone cracks with repeated stress. Wood rots, splits, and wears, and none of them can be melted down and recast into a new shape if they break. Metal could. The first metal to be worked by human beings was copper, and the first use of copper in tools predates smelting entirely. In certain parts of the world, particularly in regions of what is now Turkey, Iran, and the American Southwest, copper occurs naturally as a pure metal, not combined with other elements in an ore, but as actual metallic copper, sometimes in lumps or sheets sometimes in veins running through rock. This native copper could be hammered cold, struck repeatedly with stone until it took the desired shape. It did not need to be melted. It could simply be worked like very malleable stone. The use of native copper for small tools and ornaments dates back perhaps 10,000 years. But native copper is rare, and cold-worked copper, while somewhat harder than most stone, is still relatively soft and not ideal for large, heavy-duty agricultural implements. The real revolution came with the discovery of smelting, the process of heating copper ore with charcoal in a furnace hot enough to reduce the ore to liquid copper, which could then be poured into a mold and allowed to cool into a desired shape. This discovery, which occurred in several parts of the Old World roughly 7,000 years ago, opened up enormous new possibilities. Copper tools were cast in stone or clay molds. A mold would be shaped in the form of the desired tool, an axe head, an adze blade, a chisel, and molten copper would be poured in. When it cooled, the mold was broken open or disassembled, and the rough casting was removed and finished by hammering and grinding. The result was a tool that was harder than wood or bone, that could be given a sharp edge, and that, when it wore out or broke, could be melted down and recast. For agriculture, the arrival of copper tools brought modest but real improvements. Copper hoe blades could be made thinner and sharper than stone ones, and they were less likely to shatter on impact with a buried rock. Copper sickle blades held a better edge than stone and could be set into handles more securely. Copper adze blades made it easier to shape the wooden handles and beams of plows and other large tools. But copper had a significant drawback. It was soft. A copper sickle blade working through dry, silica-rich grain stems would lose its edge fairly quickly. A copper hoe blade driven into stony soil would bend and deform. Copper was better than stone and bone in some ways, but it was not a transformative improvement. The truly transformative development was the discovery of bronze. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of two metals, copper and tin. When approximately 90% copper is melted together with approximately 10% tin, the resulting alloy is significantly harder and stronger than either metal alone. A bronze tool holds an edge much better than copper. It is more resistant to bending and deformation under stress. It can be cast into more complex shapes. Bronze metallurgy developed in the Middle East roughly 5,000 years ago and spread gradually across Europe and Asia over the following 2,000 years. The period of its widespread use, from roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, is called, naturally enough, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age brought significant improvements to the agricultural toolkit. Bronze sickles were more efficient and longer lasting than stone or copper ones. Bronze axe heads made forest clearing easier, enabling farmers to break new ground more quickly. Bronze tips and shares for plows lasted longer and cut through soil more effectively. One of the most significant Bronze Age agricultural innovations was the development of a more sophisticated plow, the beam plow. The beam plow was a more complex construction than the simple ard, with a substantial horizontal beam connecting the share assembly at the front to the stilt handles at the back, and with a more carefully designed share angle that allowed for deeper and more consistent soil penetration. Bronze-tipped shares made it possible to work harder, stonier soils than the wooden ard could manage. The gradual, quiet accumulation of these improvements, each one small, each one building on what came before, was slowly, over thousands of years, making agriculture more productive. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the slow increment of one generation's improvements upon another, repeated over centuries, added up to something substantial. There is perhaps no agricultural landscape in the ancient world more iconic than the banks of the Nile River in Egypt. For thousands of years, from the very earliest days of Egyptian civilization to the age of the Roman Empire, the rhythms of Egyptian life were governed by the annual flooding of the Nile. Every year, with a regularity that Egyptians came to regard as one of the fundamental facts of existence, the Nile flooded. Beginning in July, as rainfall and snowmelt from the Ethiopian highlands entered the Blue Nile, one of the Nile's two main tributaries, the river rose. It rose through August and into September, spreading out across the flat farmland on either side. At its peak, the floodwater might cover the fields to a depth of several feet, depositing a fresh layer of rich, dark silt, the alluvial soil carried down from the Ethiopian mountains. Then, through October and November, the waters slowly receded, leaving behind that gift of silt on the fields. The agricultural year in ancient Egypt began in October as the floodwaters withdrew. Farmers would emerge onto their newly silted fields and begin the work of planting. Because the flood-deposited soil was already loose, moist, and fertile, very little tillage was required. In many cases, grain seeds were simply broadcast, scattered by hand across the surface of the field. And then animals, often pigs or goats or sheep, were driven across the field to tread the seeds into the soft soil with their hooves. This was simple, effective agriculture, well matched to the unique conditions of the Nile Valley. The ancient Egyptians were not primarily plow farmers in the way that Mesopotamian farmers were. Their soil, freshly deposited by the annual flood, was loose enough that heavy tillage was often unnecessary. A light scratch with a simple ard was frequently sufficient to prepare the seedbed. The Egyptian ard was a distinctive tool. Egyptian tomb paintings and relief carvings, some of the most detailed visual records of ancient agriculture that survive from anywhere in the world, show the art in use across many centuries. It was typically a lightweight implement, pulled by a pair of cattle, guided by a farmer walking behind. The share was usually simple and pointed. The handles were often curved in a way that allowed the farmer to lean into the tool and control its depth. These images in Egyptian tombs are extraordinary things. They were placed there because Egyptians believed that images of activities painted or carved in a tomb would, through a kind of sympathetic magic, enable the deceased to continue those activities in the afterlife. The result is that we have detailed visual records of Egyptian farmers plowing, sowing, harvesting, thrashing, and winnowing grain, painted with great care and specificity on the walls of tombs constructed thousands of years ago. They are our window into a daily life that would otherwise be entirely invisible to us. From these images, and from the actual tools that have been found in Egyptian sites, we know a great deal about how ancient Egyptian farmers worked. The sickle was a particularly important and well-documented tool. Egyptian sickles in the early period were typically wooden, with flint teeth set into a groove along the cutting edge. Similar in principle to the early Fertile Crescent composite sickles we discussed much earlier. Later, as bronze became available, Egyptian sickles were made with bronze blades, which were more durable and efficient. Ancient Egyptian farmers harvested grain by grasping a handful of stalks near the top, just below the seed head, and cutting through them with the sickle. The stalks were left standing in the field and were cut or gathered later for thatch or animal fodder. The seed heads were collected in baskets and carried to the thrashing floor. Thrashing, the process of separating the grain seeds from the stalks and husks, was done in Egypt primarily by driving cattle or donkeys across a pile of cut grain on a hard, flat thrashing floor. The animals' hooves broke the heads apart and freed the individual grains. Then winnowing, tossing the mixture of grain, chaff, and straw into the air so that the wind would carry away the light chaff while the heavier grain fell back to the floor, separated the edible grain from the debris. Winnowing required no special tools beyond a flat basket or a wooden shovel, but it required good timing and good conditions. A steady, moderate wind. Too little wind and the chaff didn't blow away. Too much wind and you lost grain along with the chaff. Egyptian farmers became expert at reading the afternoon breeze and choosing the right moment for winnowing, a skill that was passed down from generation to generation, part of the deep practical knowledge that sustained agricultural communities through the centuries. Across the world, in what is now central and southern China, a very different kind of agriculture was developing in parallel with everything we have discussed so far. Rice cultivation, the farming of the grain that would become the staple food of more than half of humanity, began in the Yangtze River Valley of China approximately 9,000 years ago. the wild ancestor of cultivated rice, or as a roofapagan, grew in shallow wetlands and along riverbanks, and the earliest rice farmers were working in a landscape of marshes and seasonal floodplains not entirely unlike the Nile Valley. But rice farming, as it developed, required a very different approach to field management than wheat or barley farming. Rice, particularly the varieties that became dominant in Asia, grows best in standing water. This means that rice paddies, flooded fields in which rice is grown, became the characteristic feature of Asian agricultural landscapes. Creating and maintaining a rice paddy requires a particular set of tools and techniques. The paddy field must be level. If the water is not evenly distributed across the whole field, some areas will be too wet and others too dry. Leveling a field precisely by hand with simple tools is an extremely labor-intensive process. It requires moving earth from high points to low points again and again, until the surface is as flat as the still water that will cover it. Ancient Chinese farmers used a range of tools for paddy preparation. The spade was essential, a broad-bladed, long-handled spade for moving soil. The rake was also important, a wide-toothed implement drawn through the flooded, muddy soil of a paddy to break up clumps and level the surface. The harrow, a tool consisting of a frame with pointed tines or teeth, dragged across the soil surface, was used to break up clods and create a fine, even seed bed. The harrow deserves a moment of attention, because it is an important tool that we have not yet discussed. A harrow is essentially a large comb drawn through the soil. Its purpose is different from that of the plow. Where the plow or ard creates furrows and loosens soil in a linear pattern, the harrow works the surface more uniformly, breaking up the clods left by plowing, incorporating plant material into the soil, and creating the fine, even tilth, the loose, crumbly surface that seeds prefer. Early harrows were probably just bundles of thorny branches, dragged across the field behind an animal or pulled by people. Later, wooden frames with pointed wooden teeth were made. Eventually, stone-tipped teeth and then metal teeth improved the harrow's performance. But the basic function, a toothed frame drawn across the soil surface, remained the same for thousands of years. In Chinese rice farming, the water buffalo became the primary draft animal, in much the same way that cattle were the primary draft animal in the Middle East and Europe. The water buffalo is particularly well suited to working in flooded paddy conditions. Its broad, splayed hooves do not sink into the mud the way cattle hooves do. It is powerful and tractable, willing to work in conditions that would distress most other large animals. For thousands of years, the image of a water buffalo pulling a plow through a flooded rice paddy, a man walking behind through ankle-deep water, guiding the implement, was one of the defining images of Asian agriculture. The transplanting of rice seedlings another distinctive feature of traditional Asian rice farming, also required its own tools and techniques. Rice is commonly grown in two stages. First, seeds are planted densely in a small seed bed and allowed to sprout. Then, when the seedlings are a few inches tall, they are pulled up and replanted one by one in the prepared paddy at wider spacing. This transplanting is extraordinarily labor-intensive, and it is done largely by hand, bending over the flooded field to push each tiny seedling into the mud at the correct depth and spacing. There is something almost meditative about the image of rice transplanting, the rows of workers bent over the paddy, moving steadily through the flooded field in the early morning light, the water reflecting the sky above them, the mud soft beneath their feet. It is work that demands a particular quality of presence and patience. There is nothing to hurry. Each seedling is placed just so. The next one will be placed just so, and the one after that. We have traveled a long way through time, and the night is growing deeper. Let us slow our pace even further as we reach the next great chapter in the story of agricultural tools, the arrival of iron. Iron is the fourth most common element in the Earth's crust, and iron ore, rock containing significant concentrations of iron compounds, is found in many parts of the world. In this sense, iron was far more widely available than the copper and tin needed to make bronze. But iron ore requires higher temperatures to smelt than copper ore, and the production of useful iron implements is technically more demanding than bronze casting. Iron smelting requires a furnace capable of reaching temperatures above 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to reduce iron ore to a spongy mass of metallic iron mixed with slag. This spongy mass, called a bloom, then had to be hammered while still hot to drive out the slag and consolidate the iron into a workable form. This process is called bloom smithing, or simply smithing, and the person who does it is a smith. The development of iron smithing, which occurred in several parts of the Old World roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, perhaps first in Anatolia or the Caucasus region, gradually made iron tools available first to elites, and then over centuries more widely. By around 3,000 years ago, iron was being used for agricultural tools in parts of the Middle East. By 2,500 years ago, iron agricultural tools were common across much of the Mediterranean world and the Middle East. By 2,000 years ago, they had spread through much of Europe and Asia. The impact of iron on agriculture was significant, and by the standards of the slow changes we have been discussing, relatively rapid. Iron was harder than bronze, capable of holding a sharper edge for longer, and far more widely available. Iron ore could be found in many regions where copper and tin were scarce. Iron plowshares, the cutting tips of plows, were a major improvement over wooden or bronze ones. An iron share could cut through harder, stonier soils that would break or deflect wooden or bronze shares. This meant that new areas of land could be brought under cultivation, land that had previously been too difficult to farm with softer-tipped tools. Iron sickles became the standard harvesting tool across much of the agricultural world. An iron sickle blade, properly made and maintained, could last for years or even decades with regular sharpening. It was vastly more durable than a flint composite sickle. The iron sickle blade found at archaeological sites from the Iron Age is remarkably similar in shape to the hand sickles that were being used in many parts of the world well into the 20th century. A curved blade, tapering to a point, with a serrated or plain cutting edge, attached to a wooden or bone handle. Thousands of years of gradual refinement had produced a tool whose form was so well matched to its function that it changed very little over millennia. Iron axes also transformed agriculture by making forest clearance faster and less laborious. Opening new land for farming required cutting down trees, removing stumps, and breaking up the dense root networks of woodland. Bronze axes could do this work, but iron axes were more efficient. The expansion of farmland in Iron Age Europe was partly driven by the greater ease with which iron axes could clear woodland. Among the most important Iron Age agricultural innovations was the iron-tipped or fully iron plow. As iron became more available and smiths became more skilled at working it, plow technology began to advance more rapidly than it had in previous centuries. Iron shares lasted longer. Iron coulters, vertical blades mounted in front of the share to cut through roots and tough soil crusts before the share encountered them, became possible. The coulter is a simple but clever device. It is essentially a vertical knife mounted on the plow beam ahead of the share, cutting a vertical slice through the soil just before the share cuts a horizontal slice beneath it. This makes the plow far more effective in soils that contain roots or other obstacles, because the roots are cut rather than pushed aside. The coulter is a small innovation, but it made deep plowing in previously uncultivable soils much more practical. The Roman Empire, at its height, encompassed an enormous diversity of climates, soils, and agricultural traditions. From the wheat fields of North Africa to the olive groves of Spain, from the vineyards of Gaul to the grain-growing plains of the Po Valley in northern Italy, Roman farmers were working in an extraordinary range of conditions. What unified Roman agriculture, to a greater degree than any previous civilization, was a culture of practical agricultural knowledge and a remarkable body of written agricultural literature. The Romans wrote extensively about farming. Several Roman authors produced detailed agricultural treatises that have survived, at least in part, to the present day, giving us an unusually detailed picture of how Roman farmers understood and practiced their craft. Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder, wrote a work called De Agricultura, on agriculture, in the 2nd century BCE. It is the oldest complete prose work in Latin to survive, and it is a remarkably practical document. A guide to running a Roman farm, full of specific advice about tools, crops, animals, and the management of agricultural labor. Cato's advice on tool management is particularly interesting. He recommends that a farmer should keep a careful inventory of all tools on the farm, checking regularly for breakage and wear, and should make sure that tools are repaired or replaced before planting and harvest seasons, when every tool is needed and there is no time for repairs. Columella, a Roman agriculturalist writing in the 1st century CE, produced a 12-volume work called De Re Rustica on rural matters. That is one of the most comprehensive agricultural texts from the ancient world. Columella discusses everything from soil types to crop rotation to the design and maintenance of farm buildings. His descriptions of agricultural tools are detailed and precise. From Columella and other Roman sources, we know that Roman farmers used a variety of specialized plows for different soil types and purposes. The light ard was still used on sandy or loose soils that did not require heavy tillage. A heavier plow with a more substantial iron share, and sometimes a simple form of moldboard, a curved surface that would deflect the turned soil to one side, was used on heavier soils. The concept of the moldboard plow, a plow that not only cuts a furrow but turns the slice of soil over to one side, was understood in principle by the Romans and was used in some form in parts of the Roman world. However, the full development of the heavy moldboard plow, with its characteristic ability to invert the soil completely and create the deep, turned furrows of traditional Northern European farming, came later, after the fall of the Roman Empire. Roman farmers also used a variety of specialized harvesting tools. In addition to the standard sickle, some regions of the Roman world used a harvesting machine called the vallus or Gallic reaper, described by Pliny the Elder in his Natural History. This was a wheeled cart with a comb-like set of teeth at the front, pushed through a grain field by a donkey or ox. The teeth would strip the grain heads from the stalks, which would fall into the cart to be collected. The stalks were left standing. This was not a precise instrument. It left a lot of grain behind, but it was faster than hand reaping with sickles on flat, even terrain. The Gallic reaper was used primarily in the grain-growing regions of Roman Gaul, roughly modern-day France and Belgium, where flat topography and large field sizes made it practical. It did not spread widely through the Roman world, perhaps because it was less suitable to the hilly terrain and smaller field sizes of other regions. And after the fall of Rome, it seems to have fallen out of use entirely, not to be reinvented until the 19th century, when mechanical reapers were independently developed. Roman grain processing also involved some important tools. The donkey mill, a rotary quern powered by a donkey or mule walking in a circle, was a significant improvement over the hand quern. A donkey mill could grind grain many times faster than a person using a hand stone. Large-scale donkey mills, used by commercial bakeries, could process substantial quantities of grain per day. The city of Pompeii, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, contained numerous large bakeries with donkey mills, giving archaeologists a detailed and unusually well-preserved snapshot of Roman milling technology. There is something comforting in the thought of Pompeii's bakeries. The millstones turning slowly, the flour dust drifting in the morning light, the smell of bread baking in clay ovens. People going about the business of feeding themselves and each other in the same unhurried way that people had done for thousands of years before them and would continue to do for thousands of years after. We have reached a quieter part of our journey now. Let us settle in and breathe slowly as we look at one final, important development in the ancient story of agricultural tools: the emergence of the heavy moldboard plow in Northern Europe. The soils of northern and northwestern Europe, of the heavy clay lowlands of what is now England, France, Germany, the Low Countries, are very different from the light, sandy, or silty soils of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Northern European soils tend to be dense, waterlogged, and sticky. They are extraordinarily fertile, capable of producing large harvests when properly worked. But working them is a challenge. The light ard, so effective on the dry, sandy soils of the Fertile Crescent or the flood-deposited silts of the Nile Valley, was inadequate for northern European clay. These heavy soils needed to be broken up more deeply and more thoroughly. They needed to be turned over, not just scratched. They were also prone to waterlogging. Water sat in them rather than draining away, which meant that drainage was as important as irrigation. The development of the heavy moldboard plow, sometimes called the carruca in medieval sources, addressed these challenges. This was a substantially more complex piece of engineering than the simple ard. It had a heavy iron coulter to cut through roots and tough sod. It had a substantial iron share to cut horizontally through the soil. And it had a moldboard, a curved, flat surface behind and beside the share that caught the slice of soil cut by the share and turned it over to one side, exposing the subsoil and burying the surface vegetation. Turning the soil over in this way had several benefits. It buried surface weeds and their seeds, suppressing weed growth. It brought subsoil minerals to the surface, where they could be broken down and made available to plants. It created a more open, aerated structure in the soil, and it helped with drainage by creating raised ridges between the furrows through which water could run off. But the heavy moldboard plow had one significant disadvantage. It required a great deal of draft power to pull. The light ard could be managed with a pair of oxen. The heavy moldboard plow, working in stiff clay, might require 4, 6, or even 8 oxen working together. This was far more draft power than a single family could maintain. It required the resources of an entire village. This need led in many parts of medieval northern Europe to a characteristic social arrangement, the cooperative management of plowing. Villagers would pool their oxen and their labor to plow each other's fields in turn. The individual who owned the plow and the team of oxen, or who could contribute the most animals to the shared team, was often a person of significance in the village community. The plow team was a community resource, and managing it was a community responsibility. The shape of the fields themselves changed with the heavy moldboard plow, because turning a team of 8 oxen at the end of a furrow was slow and difficult. A long, wide arc was required, and it took time and space. Farmers preferred to make their furrows as long as possible to minimize the number of turns required. This led to the characteristic long, narrow field strips of medieval European agriculture, fields that might be a quarter mile or more in length, but only a few yards wide. The long, parallel ridges and furrows of these ancient field systems are still visible in some parts of England and continental Europe today, preserved as subtle waves in the landscape long after the fields themselves were abandoned. It is a remarkable thing to think about, that the shape of a landscape, the gentle undulation of a hillside in rural England, might still bear the imprint of a plow that was last used 1,000 years ago. The past leaves traces everywhere if you know what to look for. And sometimes those traces are in the quietest, most overlooked places. The slight ridge across a meadow, the faint line of a former field boundary in a grassy field, the shadow of an old furrow in the long light of a summer evening. We have traveled far tonight. We have moved through 12,000 years of human history, tracing the slow, patient evolution of the tools that made civilization possible. We began with a digging stick, a sharpened branch, hardened in fire, simple enough that a child could understand it. We end with the heavy moldboard plow, a complex iron-fitted machine requiring the cooperation of a whole community to use. Between those 2 points, the distance in time is enormous. 12,000 years. 400 generations, but the distance in spirit, in the quality of attention and care that a farmer brought to the work of feeding themselves and their family, is not so great. The woman with her digging stick, loosening the earth around a wild grain plant 9,000 years before the Common Era, was doing something essentially similar to the medieval English farmer guiding 8 oxen through the heavy clay of a Midlands field in the 12th century. Both were paying attention to the soil. Both were working carefully. Both were trusting that the earth would receive what they gave it and return something in kind. And in that trust, that slow, patient, ancient trust between human beings and the land, lies something that is perhaps the deepest and most enduring fact of all our long agricultural history. We are still in many ways the same people who first bent down and pressed a seed into the soil and waited to see what would come up. We still depend on the earth, on the sun, on the water. We still measure our deepest needs in terms of harvest and hunger, abundance and scarcity. The tools have changed. They have grown enormously more powerful and complex. But the need they serve, the need to be fed, to be sustained, to find in the living earth something that will keep us alive and let us rest at the end of a long day, that need is as old as we are, and it will be as new as the morning. The sun is setting now over a very old field. The earth is warm from the day's heat. The grain stands quietly in rows, waiting for harvest. Somewhere, not too far away, there is the sound of oxen lowing softly in a barn, and the smell of hay, and the long, low light of an ancient evening spreading golden across the furrows. Sleep well, the fields are tended. The seeds are in the earth. Everything that needs doing has been done as it has been done, season after season, for longer than memory. Rest now,